Running past the morning crowd on the bridge in Texas, she clutched a gun in her purse. She stopped every 5 minutes to catch her breath and look at a photo of her next target, a florist. She had been hunting him for a year. Tracked him down on the web, asked about him, criminals with whom he worked. I even made friends with his relatives to find out his whereabouts. And now she was closer than ever to the goal. Miriam got a call from his widow and told her that he was selling flowers at the border. Since 2014, she has been tracking down people involved in the abduction and murder of her 20-year-old daughter Karen. Half of these people were already behind bars. And this happened not at all because the authorities covered up a large criminal network, but due to the fact that they were pursued by one woman, driven only by the desire for boundless revenge for her own daughter. She cut and dyed her hair. The stomp of a sociologist, the stomp of a medical worker, or a member of the election commission was masked. In order to get their names and addresses, she came up with reasons to get to know their family members. Unsuspecting grandmothers and cousins. She extracted valuable information from all of them, bit by bit. She wrote down every detail and stored these details in a black computer bag. She competently built her investigation and tracked one by one. She knew their habits, their friends, the homes where they grew up, and their childhood friends. She knew that the florist sold flowers on the street, and then became a member of the Zeta cartel, and was involved in the abduction of her daughter. Now he was on the run, and had to do what he knew how to do before joining the gang: selling roses to make ends meet. Before she had time to take a shower, she threw a raincoat right over her pajamas. She put on a baseball cap to cover her red hair, put the gun in her purse, and headed to the border in search of a florist. On the bridge, she began to look closely at the flower sellers, but it turned out that on that day the one she was looking for was selling sunglasses. When she finally discovered him, she got very excited and got too close. He recognized her and ran away. He ran down a narrow pedestrian crosswalk, hoping to get out of sight. At that time she was 56 years old. She caught up with him, grabbed his t-shirt, and threw him on the handrails. She put a gun to his back. "You move, and I'll shoot you." This was told by witnesses who were present at that chase. So she held him for an hour until the police arrived at the scene and arrested a gang member. Her name was Miriam Rodríguez. She was a well-known Mexican human rights activist. She was best known as the founder of the Miss Child's organization, Parents of Missing Children. Within 3 years, Rodríguez tracked down and caught up with almost all the living gang members who were involved in the kidnapping of her daughter for ransom. It was a whole mountain of criminals who were trying to start a new life: taxi driver, car salesman, babysitter, and others. She played a crucial role in the destruction of 10 criminals. Her company for justice became known to everyone in the district. No one has ever thought of challenging organized crime before, let alone putting its members in jail. She asked the government to provide her with armed guards because she understood. Sooner or later they'll get her. On the 10th of May, 2017, on Mother's Day, a few weeks after she reached her last target, Miriam was shot dead on her own doorstep. Her husband was at home watching TV. Later, he found his wife lying face down in the street. Her hands were inside her purse, clutching the gun. For many residents of the Mexican northern city of San Fernando, her story is the personification of all the mistakes of Mexico, and, on the contrary, the will of its wonderful citizens, their disagreement with the indifference of the government. A woman died because, as a mother, she was simply trying to protect her child in a country torn apart by violence and impunity. Her deafening company, retold in the case materials, witness statements, confessions of criminals. In dozens of conversations with their relatives, police officers, friends, officials, and ordinary local residents. All of this has changed San Fernando beyond recognition. At least for a while. In honor of Miriam Rodríguez, a bronze memorial plaque was installed in the central square of the city. Her son Luis led a group created by his mother, which included members of many local families whose loved ones were missing. The authorities promised to catch the killers of Miriam Rodríguez. Plagued by decades of violence, a brutal war between cartels, the murder of 72 migrants, and the massacre of Miriam Rodríguez, San Fernando went quiet for a while. This lull lasted until July 2000, when 14-year-old Luciano Lee Algarza was abducted right on the street. And his abduction has become the most high-profile case since Miriam Rodríguez's peculiar crusade. Miriam's son, Louis, 37, couldn't help but draw parallels and cry when he heard the news. Luciano was abducted right out of the car, as was Karen Rodríguez. His family paid the kidnappers a ransom twice, but these efforts did not bring results. History repeated itself again. The townspeople staged a rally. "I demand that the authorities get the guy out." The police searched every piece of the territory. The guy's mother, a charismatic and fearless woman named Annabelle, began to speak on behalf of relatives of the missing, of whom there are about 70,000 people in a small Mexico. In general, the number of people killed in this country has doubled over the past 5 years. However, this time the war is going very differently. Miriam Rodríguez, thanks to her courage and determination to find her daughter, has become a kind of travel star, a symbol of hope for those who are trying to find Lucian. But the brutal massacre of her became a warning to anyone who tries to follow her path. Lucian's parents are no longer trying to find and punish the kidnappers. How do they hope to see their son alive already? They're scared. Miriam Rodríguez was constantly interrupted by the walkie-talkie that hung on the kidnapper's belt, while the mother begged for her daughter's return. The weeks since Karen Rodríguez's abduction have turned into a sickening series of calls, threats, and false promises. In order to pay the first part of the ransom for their daughter, the Rodríguez couple took out a loan from a bank. It is interesting that banks in Mexico are ready to provide loans for exactly such purposes, since kidnapping is a common phenomenon in this state. Mother and father followed all the instructions in the letter. Karen's father put a bag of cash near the clinic. Then he waited for the kidnappers at the local cemetery, as it was said in the letter. But it was all in vain. A little later, his wife arranged a meeting with members of the local Zeta cartel. To the woman's surprise, they agreed. She booked a table at El Junior restaurant, and a thin young man sat down next to her. It was 2014 year. It was a particularly shocking time for San Fernando. Many bars and restaurants were closed due to the shooting. There were many mass graves, where sometimes up to 20 bodies could be found. The Zeta cartel was once the armed wing of the Persian Gulf cartel. Then they decided to break away and become an independent group, which is why they fought with their former bosses for many years. They kidnapped innocent people for ransom to finance their war, or recruited fighters into their ranks in this way. Sometimes they staged deadly fights between prisoners for the sake of a vivid spectacle. Luis, Karen's older brother, left San Fernando for a safer place. But his sister decided to stay in town, finish school here, and help her mother with a small rodeo boots store, where the family sold cowboy clothes. On January 23, 2014, Karen, while driving her pickup truck, saw two trucks in front and behind the car. Several armed men got into her car and drove off in an unknown direction. It turned out that the kidnappers took the girl to her house, where Karen lived for a week while her mother was in Texas, where she worked as a babysitter. When Karen was lying on the living room floor, bound and gagged, there was a knock on the door. It was her uncle, an unsuspecting mechanic who undertook to repair the family truck. The kidnappers panicked and grabbed him, and then fled. Now Rodriguez was sitting with one of the gang members in a restaurant, begging for Karen's release. The bandit had a walkie-talkie hanging on his belt, which was constantly chirping. He assured the woman that the cartel was not involved in the abduction of her daughter. However, he offered the cartel services in finding his daughter and asked for $2,000 for these services. And Rodriguez paid. Through the static in the walkie-talkie, she heard someone call his name herself. After a week, he stopped answering calls. But other people started calling and claiming that they were kidnappers. They needed some money. It's only $500. Karen's parents doubted that such a sum would bring their daughter home, but they sent the money anyway. With each new payment, Rodriguez had a new hope for her daughter's release. On the contrary, with each failed attempt to get Karen back, Miriam became more and more desperate. Hope is a poison that poisons many families of the missing. They either try to move on and thus get rid of this poison, or they are absorbed in often aimless hopes. And this poison destroys them day after day. Rodriguez has already moved from her husband to her eldest daughter Azalea. One morning, a few weeks after the last payment, she came downstairs and told Azalea that they did not believe in Karen's return, and that, most likely, the youngest daughter was already dead. She said all this dryly and calmly, as if she was recounting her terrible dream. She also told her daughter that she would not rest until she found the people who kidnapped Karen. She will hunt them down one by one until she dies. Azalea watched as her mother's grief was replaced by determination, and hope was replaced by a sense of revenge. Her mom has become a different person. Life in San Fernando assumes that a person agrees with certain realities. Families suffer from endless kidnappings and curfews, just as residents of large cities suffer from constant traffic jams and environmental conditions. Because of the constant gang fights, the average life expectancy in San Fernando is very reduced. It's like there's a war going on here, and it's touched every house. Missing sons, dead loved ones, abandoned houses and buildings. For a city with a population of only 60,000 people, San Fernando has a very bad reputation. This town is located along the northern route through the state of Tamaulipas. Outside of the city, a network of branched highways begins, each of which leads to the border with the United States. No less extensive networks of dirt roads run alongside these highways. Ideal routes for traffickers. In 2000, the federal authorities found the bodies of 72 migrants from Central America. They were found on a ranch on the outskirts of town. At that time, it was the most monstrous murder committed by the cartel, and already in the 2011 year, after the frequent cases of abductions of bus passengers. A mass grave was discovered on the outskirts of San Fernando, in which there were almost 200 bodies. There were those who decided to move from San Fernando to avoid violence. Others decided to stay. Among them was Lucian's family. Lucian's grandfather, who was also called Luciana, started a cargo transportation business from scratch, and subsequently opened a cinder block manufacturing company. The boy's father, also Luciana, is the owner of a store selling building materials. At that time, a 14-year-old boy in his spare time from school helped both his father and grandfather at work. Like any resident of this city, Luciano's relatives knew the story of Karen's abduction and the tragic heroism of her mother Miriam. They also knew that their thriving business made them the most attractive targets for bandits, even more attractive than the Rodriguez family. Over the years, the kidnappers have already received a ransom for several members of Lucian's family, including his father, who was held hostage for 33 days in the year 2012. The relatives took serious security measures and practically watched their children around the clock. But the kidnappers knew exactly when and how to strike. For several weeks, they corresponded with Luciano on Facebook on behalf of a young girl. "You are very nice," he wrote from his account. "I'd like to meet you." This day came on the 8th of July, 2020 year. They agreed to meet briefly in the park. Luciano was being looked after by one of his sisters. He texted her that he would be staying for a while. The guy took one of the family cars, in which he was allowed to move around the city. I drove away from home, and in a few seconds, the same trick was repeated as from Karen Rodriguez 6 years ago. Over the next few hours, Luciano's family combed the city. It was only after his sister looked at his page that everyone realized what had happened. Shortly after the disappearance of the guy, the kidnappers called his father and handed the phone to the teenager. The first thing he asked was if his two younger sisters were safe. The very next day, Luciano's father took off a whole bag of cash and took it to an abandoned road perpendicular to the one where Karen's father brought the money. Another day later, the kidnappers said that this is not enough and they want more. To transfer the next payment, Luciano's father drove for 2 hours to an abandoned gas station. There he left the bag between two worn-out tires. As soon as he returned to San Fernando, the kidnappers called again. They promised to deliver Lucian home that night. No one was sleeping. Relatives reacted to every rustle. But the guy never got home. The very next morning, the kidnappers stopped answering calls, and the family realized that they would never see Luciano again. At least, they lost all hope for that. Having overcome their fears, they decided to contact the police. They had nothing to lose. After all, the biggest fear for any parent is to lose their own child. And Lucian's parents have already experienced this fear. Any photo in the media, even the smallest fry in the world of gangsters. Miriam Rodríguez got on Sammy's tail. She was already convinced that he was involved in Karen's abduction. She found out about it thanks to a mechanic who was abducted along with her daughter. Subsequently, the bandits released him because there was no particular point in keeping him captive. The man found Miriam and got a story from him about everything. In general, about everything he saw or heard while in captivity. The woman searched for information in the media, spent countless hours browsing Karen's Facebook page. The woman was looking for clues. One morning, stretched out on the couch and browsing Facebook, Miriam came across a photo with the caption herself. She immediately realized that this was the man who had met her in the restaurant. Also thin and smooth-shaven face. In the photo next to him was a woman dressed in the uniform of an ice cream shop clerk, which was located in the city of Su Victoria, which is 2 hours away from San Fernando. Miriam Rodríguez watched this store for several weeks until she found out the woman's working hours. For the past 2 weeks, Miriam has been coming to the store towards the end of the woman's working shifts and waited for Sama to appear. Finally, after waiting for him to appear, she followed the couple to their house and memorized the destination address. But to involve the police in the case, knowing the address was not enough. She needed a name. And for this it was necessary to get to know her friend better. Miriam Rodríguez cut her hair short and dyed it bright red so that he could not recognize her. She put on a government uniform that she had left over from her previous job at the Ministry of Health. Taking her official ID with her, Miriam spent more than half of the day conducting fake surveys of neighbors, quietly asking them questions about one of her daughter's kidnappers. Having received the necessary information, Miriam went to the authorities, local, state, and federal authorities. But no one agreed to help her. She carried the collected materials with her everywhere. But everywhere she was told no. In the end, she found a federal policeman who agreed to help. When she put the materials on the table, I was very surprised. I've never seen anything like this before. The detailed information was collected by a woman with no relevant experience who worked alone. This was reported by an officer who asked journalists not to disclose his name. She visited all government floors, and doors were closed in her face everywhere. Helping her find her daughter's kidnappers has become the greatest mission of my career. However, when the authorities finally issued an arrest warrant for Sama, he had already managed to slip away. Frustrated, Miriam Rodríguez redoubled her efforts to find the rest of the gang. And soon she had a huge stack of photos that captured the people she was interested in. And then, purely by chance, I got caught myself. It happened on the 15th of September, 2014 year. On the eve of Mexico's Independence Day, Luis, Miriam's son, started closing his store in Udo Victoria early, in order to be in time for the celebration. The last customer remained in the store, a young, thin man. He was examining the hats. Louis took a closer look at him and recognized herself. He called his mother and followed the man, trying not to catch his eye. And then he called the police. When Sama was arrested in the central square, he started fighting and shouting, claiming that he had heart problems. While in custody, he described in detail the details missing from the investigation of Miriam Rodríguez. He gave the names and locations of some accomplices to one of them, Christian Jose with Apati Gonzalez, who had just turned 18. He was very young, even by the standards of the cartel. During the interrogation, the young man looked scared. While Miriam was waiting outside the interrogation room, the teenager asked if he could see his mother. He told the officer he was hungry. Touched, Miriam entered the room and gave him her lunch, a piece of fried chicken. And a little later, I went to the store and bought him soda. When she returned, the officer asked what she was thinking. He's still a kid, no matter what he's done. And I'm still a mother. It's like he's my own child. Perhaps thanks to this attitude, Christian calmed down and told the police everything. I'll take you to the ranch where they kill and then bury them. That's what Christian said about the victim of his kidnappings. A dilapidated tractor marked a grave on an abandoned ranch at the end of a dirt road. Bullet holes gape in the wall of a brick house, reminding of a shootout that happened here a few months earlier. Christian's statement says Mexican Marines killed 6 accomplices. Miriam Rodríguez was picking through the wreckage left by the kidnappers. Terrible stains on dirty countertops, bones of different sizes, some fragments. A noose hung from the branch of a gnarled tree. She froze when she found a stack of personal items thrown into a pile. At the top of the pile was Karen's scarf and a seat cushion from her car. Forensic experts determined that Karen's remains were not found among the remains buried at the ranch. But Miriam decided to challenge these conclusions. And I was not mistaken. The following year, a group of scientists managed to discover parts of a femur that belonged to her daughter. Most of the security forces were not too willing to express gratitude to Miriam Rodríguez, mostly because of her rudeness in dealing with them. Not everyone got along with her, but everyone respected what she did. On the way back from the ranch, Rodríguez stopped at a barbecue restaurant near the exit to the dirt road to the ranch. She had lunch there with her eldest daughter Azalea. just 2 days after Karen was abducted. That day, a good friend of hers named Elvia Ulisa Betancourt was sitting at one of the tables. She was pulling up a soda. Rodriguez greeted her and asked if she had heard of Karen. By the way, then everyone already knew about it. But Betancourt pretended not to hear, and Miriam thought it was very strange. Now, as Miriam Rodríguez drove past the restaurant again, it dawned on her. Maybe the young woman knew something. She might even have been watching the ranch in case the police came. Miriam's fear turned to rage. She knew Betancourt from childhood. She was the daughter of a prostitute. Her mother abandoned her to babies in a local brothel. Miriam often gave this girl Karen's old clothes. Miriam Rodríguez went home and again plunged into the search, discovering that Betancourt was in a relationship with one of Karen's kidnappers. This kidnapper was already in prison. He was convicted of another crime. As with the ice cream shop, Miriam spent several weeks watching the prison during visiting hours. She was waiting for Elvia Betancourt to appear. And one day she did show up there. The police arrested the girl, and, as it turned out later, some of the ransom calls for Karen were made from her house. Months passed. The diligent mother continued to collect evidence from the case materials. But every day the traces disappeared. Some of those involved in the crime were dead, others were behind bars. Those who remained at large tried to live a new life, working as taxi drivers, couriers, or became strongly believing Christians. Miriam went to Oldama, the hometown of Enrique Rubio Flores, where 13,000 people live. She visited the guy's grandmother. Sighing heavily, the elderly woman told her that trouble always happened to the guy. But at least now he attends church. Naturally, Miriam started going to the same church where she found her next victim. When the police arrived and arrested the criminal in the chapel, the parishioners could not believe that he could have done something illegal. The young man asked the woman for mercy, but she only grinned and said, "Where was your compassion when you killed my daughter?" Lucian's abduction changed something in San Fernando. Most of the locals did not speak out against organized crime. The police could hardly have done anything, but the cartel would certainly have done something against anyone who opposed it. Most often in the form of violence. Many justify their silence by saying that the victims themselves were engaged in illegal activities. However, the silence was broken by the abduction of a 14-year-old boy. In this way, his family, like Miriam Rodríguez, violated the usual rules of how victims usually react in such cases. They called on friends and townspeople to go with them and demand Lucian's return. They organized search parties. They held press conferences. His mother recorded a heartbreaking message to the kidnappers so that they would return her son. This message was turned on at full volume by drivers in their cars. In August of 2000, the Luciano family went to Mexico City to put pressure on the government. They slept in tents set up in the city center and walked around in ponchos. These actions were successful. The government has sent a detachment of soldiers, police officers, and investigators to San Fernando. 2 or 3 times a week, they conducted searches. Law enforcement officers crossed the vast expanses of the arid outskirts of San Fernando. But no matter how far they searched, they would never be able to cover the entire territory. Who knows how many vacant lots are filled with unmarked graves? Louis, Miriam's son, knew from his own experience that there was only one way to find the body. It was to talk to someone. In the case of his sister Karen, the teenager Christian turned out to be such a person. Lucian's family couldn't find the right person. And in September, when the police captured the head of the cartel, he refused to cooperate with them. By that time, the family knew who was to blame for the abduction. They were members of their own family. After studying Luciano's Facebook account, the police became convinced that Luciano's mother had suspected for a long time. Several of her cousins are members of criminal gangs. They teamed up with members of a local cartel to extort money from their own family. But by that time the cousins were nowhere to be found. And the search for Lucian yielded nothing. Now they seemed almost superficial instead of answers. The family received threats, anonymous calls and messages that forced them to stop searching. Luciano's mom ignored these calls just like Miriam Rodríguez. But the family still requested protection from the government. Father Luciano said, "Right now we are asking for the same thing that Miriam has repeatedly asked for: protection. Or are you waiting for them to kill us?" After Karen disappeared, her father changed a lot. Once active, he rarely left the house now. He slowly shrank physically and spiritually until his children stopped recognizing him. For Miriam, the pursuit of justice has become a way to avoid pain. But this method had to pay too high a price. Her public company threatened not only some ordinary kidnappers. She threatened a number of things to San Fernando. Her friends often wondered how far she had managed to go. "I don't care if they kill me. I died when they killed my daughter. I want to end this. I will remove the people who hurt my daughter. And they can do whatever they want with me." In March 2017, about 24 prisoners staged an escape from the prison in Ciudad Victoria, where Miriam hid many of her daughter's kidnappers. Concerned, she asked the government for protection. The police agreed to periodically send a patrol to her house and to her place of work. Her family was unhappy with this, but it could not stop the woman. A month before the murder, Miriam Rodríguez broke her leg while chasing one of the last targets on her list, a young girl who left the city and got a job as a nanny in Victoria. Being true to her traditions, Rodríguez spent days on end near the house where this girl worked. The woman was waiting for her appearance. Miriam didn't get out of the car to relieve herself. "I put the battery on while I listened to the radio while waiting." When the police finally arrested the girl, Miriam, running towards them, broke her leg. On Mother's Day, the woman's leg was still in a cast, and she used crutches. On the 10th of May, 2017, at 22 hours and 21 minutes, Miriam Rodríguez approached her house. She and her husband lived in a small orange house where Karen used to live. The woman parked on the street, got out of the car, and slowly walked towards the house. A white Nissan, driven by the men who escaped from prison, was behind Miriam. They fired 13 times. The government was quick to respond to this murder. Within a few months, it arrested 2 perpetrators and killed another in a shootout. As for the customers of this murder, who were afraid of her activity more than the consequences of the murder. At present, their names are not subject to disclosure in the interests of the investigation. After Miriam's death, her son Louis took over the management of her company. However, after her death, this movement died out. Some members of the company separated and organized their own groups. Others decided to be silent so that they would not be overtaken by the same fate. In June of the same year, almost a month after Miriam's murder, Veracruz state officials, relying on the information provided by Miriam, arrested another suspect in the case of Karen's abduction. This woman beat and tortured the girl during the abduction. She hung her up like a punching bag and beat her. After these events, the woman moved to Veracruz and got a job as a taxi driver. She has a young son. Miriam Rodríguez found her too. Louis was late for the funeral. He arrived after the procession moved through the streets filled with residents who watched Lucian's coffin. Not far from the guy's burial place, when the crowd surrounded the rectangular pit, Louis, Miriam's son, stood and cried. The authorities found the body of a teenager in October 2020 year, in a shallow pit behind an acacia grove on the northern outskirts of San Fernando. The killers threw garbage at this place to cover their tracks. A few weeks earlier, volunteers inspected the place, but did not notice the burial. Law enforcement agencies refused to tell how they found the grave. One of them said that the investigators used the triangulation method and tracked the location of the body using cellular base stations. But this version does not look plausible. A few hours before the discovery of the body, the police found a teenage cousin who was one of the organizers of his abduction. He was found in the hospital with a gunshot wound to the leg. Since then, he has been charged with kidnapping and murder. The townspeople, long accustomed to silently avert their eyes, watched as the funeral procession crawled through the streets, so that hundreds of mourners on foot could follow it. Shop assistants brought water to these people because it was 40-degree heat. The orchestra was playing. The speeches of his parents brought tears to the crowd, especially from Luisa and his sister Azalea. They lost their sister and mother in this war. Luciano's father expressed gratitude to the police. After all, he managed to at least see the body of his child and bury it. Luciano's mom thanked everyone for taking the risk in finding her son. "You have taught my family that together we can fight back. We have to get rid of the fear of standing up and speaking out." It was hard for Louis and Azalea to listen to this. They drew parallels with their mother, who was buried just 30 meters from Lucian's grave. That's about what Miriam said. And these words were carved on a plaque on her grave. Azalea hugged Lucian's mother and did not let her go for more than a minute. Luis shook hands with Father Luciano. Without saying a word, he left, wiping away his tears. At the very beginning of the investigation of Luciano's abduction, Luis introduced his family to the police officers, who investigated the abduction of Karen and then the murder of Miriam. But when he offered to accompany the investigation with the involvement of search dogs trained to find corpses, Luciano's parents were very offended with him. Then they still hoped to see their son alive. The procession dispersed. Luisa Azalea went to her mother's grave. Karen's remains were buried here, next to her mother. They know that they are the lucky few who, at least, have a place to mourn the dead. But there are a lot of families who have not found their loved ones. The fact that Karen and her mom Miriam Rodríguez were now resting next to each other was at least some consolation. Louis and Azalea sat for a while until the sun began to shine less brightly. They indulged in pleasant memories, something they rarely allowed themselves to do. The cemetery was empty, but they stayed, trying to hold this moment as long as possible. Miriam Rodríguez Martinez, in the year 2012, organized 600 families in her city, who were victims of violence. The group of families she organized is part of a broader movement that expanded after 43 students of a teacher training college, who studied in the state of Guerrero, disappeared in October of the 2014 year. There are now at least 13 such groups in Mexico. For the murder of Miriam Rodríguez, only 2 sentences were handed down, 10 and 15 years against 2 criminals, Eric Lionel and Alfred Misael, respectively. The organizers of the crimes have not been identified. Other alleged perpetrators of the crimes refused to testify. They are serving sentences for various crimes. Another one was killed during the arrest.